May 24, 1941. The Denmark Strait churned beneath a sky the color of gunmetal. HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, the largest warship afloat, bore down on her German adversary with guns blazing. 42,000 tons of British steel and confidence sailed straight into history's cruelest lesson. Then, in a single catastrophic moment, a shell from the Bismarck found her magazine. The explosion tore the Hood in half. 1,400 men vanished in 3 minutes. Only 3 survived. The shockwave rippled across the Atlantic, across London, across the world. Britain's invincible symbol lay shattered beneath the waves. The German battleships seemed unstoppable, armored titans that laughed at conventional attack. Yet within 4 years, these same monsters of the deep would be gutted, crippled, and sent to the ocean floor, not by other battleships, not by massive naval guns, but by fragile biplanes, made of fabric and wood, flown by men who had never seen combat before. Aircraft so slow a modern car could outrun them. Torpedoes so unreliable, they were nicknamed tin fish that swim in circles. How did the hunters become the hunted? How did obsolete relics of aviation tear apart the most powerful warships ever built? The answer lies not in superior firepower, but in desperation, innovation, and the kind of courage that borders on madness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The year 1939 marked the beginning of a nightmare that would consume the world. When Hitler's forces rolled into Poland, the British Empire found itself staring at a threat it had not faced in a century. The German Kriegsmarine, rebuilt in secret defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, had unleashed upon the Atlantic a new breed of warship. These were not merely vessels, they were fortresses that moved. The Bismarck displaced over 50,000 tons when fully loaded. Her armor belt measured 12 inches thick in places, designed to shrug off shells that would sink lesser ships. 8 15-inch guns could hurl a shell weighing nearly a ton across 20 miles of ocean. Her sister ship, the Torpedoes, waited in Norwegian fjords, a ghost that paralyzed Allied convoy planning simply by existing. Then came the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, fast battle cruisers that could outrun what they could not outfight, terrorizing merchant shipping lanes like wolves among sheep. The Graf Spee had already proven the threat during her rampage across the South Atlantic, sinking 9 merchant vessels before being cornered at Montevideo. Though she was scuttled by her own crew, her brief career demonstrated a chilling reality. A single German capital ship could tie down dozens of Allied warships, disrupt entire convoy systems, and strangle Britain's lifeline across the Atlantic. Britain was an island. Every drop of fuel, every ton of grain, every bullet and bandage had to cross 3,000 miles of hostile ocean. If the convoy stopped, Britain starved. If Britain starved, Europe fell. The mathematics were brutal and simple. German U-boats prowled in wolf packs, but they were a known threat, countered by sonar, depth charges, and escort destroyers. The battleships, however, were different. They could emerge from the fog, annihilate an entire convoy in hours, and vanish back into the vastness of the North Atlantic before the Royal Navy could respond. Admiralty planners worked through sleepless nights, trying to predict their movements. Every capital ship had to be shadowed, every convoy route adjusted, every home fleet sortie planned around the possibility that Bismarck or Torpedoes might break out into the shipping lanes. It was a war of nerves as much as steel. In the spring of 1940, Norway fell. With it, Germany gained anchorages along the Norwegian coast, deep fjords where battleships could hide beneath overhanging cliffs, invisible to reconnaissance and ready to strike. The strategic implications were catastrophic. The Royal Navy now had to guard not just the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, but the entire Norwegian Sea. Resources stretched thin. Destroyers meant for convoy escort were pulled into patrol duty. Battleships that should have been refitting sat at anchor in Scapa Flow, waiting, watching, burning fuel while doing nothing. The Admiralty knew they could not sustain this forever. They needed a way to neutralize the German surface fleet without committing their own dwindling battleship force to endless patrols. They needed a weapon that could reach into those Norwegian fjords, penetrate the anti-aircraft defenses, and cripple a battleship before it ever left port. The answer, improbable as it seemed, lay with the fleet, established only in 1937, after decades of bureaucratic struggle between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air. The Fleet Air Arm was the neglected stepchild of British military aviation. While the RAF received Spitfires and Hurricanes, sleek modern fighters that could dance through the sky, the Fleet Air Arm made do with leftovers. Chief among these leftovers was the ferry Swordfish, a biplane torpedo bomber that looked like it had escaped from a museum. First flown in 1934, the Swordfish had a maximum speed of around 130 miles per hour in ideal conditions. Its airframe was fabric stretched over a metal skeleton. Its open cockpit exposed the crew to North Atlantic gales that could freeze a man's hands to his controls. It carried a single 18-inch torpedo or bombs, operated by a crew of 3, a pilot, an observer who navigated and dropped the torpedo, and a rear gunner with a single machine gun for defense. By 1940, it was already obsolete. Modern fighters could fly twice as fast, dive bombers could carry heavier loads, yet the Swordfish had one advantage nobody had anticipated. It was so slow that enemy gunners could not adjust their aim properly. Anti-aircraft systems designed to track fast modern aircraft would overshoot, their predictive mechanisms confused by a target lumbering through the sky at speeds a World War I fighter would have considered inadequate. Among the men training to fly these relics was Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmonde. Born in 1909 in Yorkshire, Esmonde had joined the Royal Navy in 1928, drawn by a family tradition of service that stretched back generations. He was not a man of towering charisma or fiery rhetoric. Those who knew him described a quiet professionalism, a meticulous attention to detail, and an unshakable sense of duty. He had trained as a pilot in the early 1930s, learning to land on the pitching decks of aircraft carriers when such maneuvers were still experimental and frequently fatal. By 1939, he was a seasoned officer, respected by his peers, trusted by his superiors, and utterly convinced that naval aviation, primitive as it seemed, would prove decisive in the coming war. He commanded a squadron of Swordfish aboard HMS Victorious, one of the Royal Navy's newest carriers. The ship herself was barely complete, rushed into service with workmen still aboard finishing her compartments. Her air group was equally rushed, pilots with minimal carrier experience, observers fresh from navigation school, gunners who had never fired at a real target. They drilled endlessly, practicing torpedo runs against towed targets in the Firth of Forth, learning to skim 15 feet above the wave tops, low enough that the torpedo would not porpoise on impact, high enough to avoid crashing into the swells. It was unforgiving work. A single mistake, a momentary loss of altitude, a gust of wind, and the aircraft would cartwheel into the sea. Several did, the survivors learned. In May 1941, intelligence reached the Admiralty that chilled the blood of every officer who read it. Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen had left their anchorage at Gotenhafen, in occupied Poland. They were steaming north. Reconnaissance confirmed sightings near Bergen, Norway. The breakout the Admiralty had dreaded was underway. If Bismarck reached the Atlantic convoy routes, the carnage would be unimaginable. Every available warship was scrambled. Battleships King George V and Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser Hood, cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk, destroyers by the dozen, all converged on the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between the ice fields of Greenland and the minefields off Iceland. It was there, in the gray pre-dawn light of May 24th, that Hood met her fate. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. Hood opened fire first, her shells straddling Bismarck at a range of over 25,000 yards. Bismarck replied. Her fifth salvo struck Hood just aft of the mainmast. The shell plunged through the deck armor, through compartments and bulkheads, and detonated in the aft magazine, where 400-pound cordite charges sat ready. The explosion broke the spine of the ship. Eyewitnesses on Prince of Wales, sailing just behind Hood, saw the massive vessel erupt in a tower of flame that climbed 1,000 feet into the sky. When the smoke cleared, Hood was gone. Debris rained from the sky. Oil spread across the surface. Of 1,418 men, 3 lived. The shock reverberated through the Royal Navy with the force of the explosion itself. Hood had been more than a ship. She was a symbol, the embodiment of British naval supremacy, a vessel that had sailed to every corner of the empire, showing the flag, reminding the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. Her loss was not just a tactical disaster. It was a psychological blow that threatened to unravel morale across the fleet. Prince of Wales, though newer and theoretically more powerful, was forced to break off the engagement after taking multiple hits. Her guns rushed into service with civilian technicians still aboard trying to fix mechanical problems, jammed repeatedly. She retired behind a smokescreen, leaving Bismarck wounded but operational. A shell from Prince of Wales had ruptured one of Bismarck's fuel tanks, leaving a telltale oil slick trailing behind her, but the German battleship was still afloat, still dangerous, and now steaming deeper into the Atlantic with only a handful of British ships shadowing at extreme range. The Admiralty issued a simple order: sink the Bismarck. Every ship, every aircraft, every available resource was to be committed. If she escaped into the vastness of the Atlantic, if she linked up with supply ships and began raiding convoys, the war itself might tilt. Winston Churchill himself followed the hunt, demanding updates every hour, haunted by the specter of Hood's death and the possibility of more to come. Among the forces scrambled was HMS Victorious, rushing south from Scapa Flow with Eugene Esmond's squadron of swordfish aboard. The carrier was so new, her air group had barely qualified for deck landings. Most of the pilots had fewer than 10 carrier landings in their logbook. None had ever attacked a real target, much less a battleship capable of throwing up a curtain of anti-aircraft fire that could shred an aircraft before it came within a mile. The orders were clear but daunting: launch a torpedo strike against Bismarck, slow her down enough for the heavy units of the home fleet to catch up and finish her. It was a mission born of desperation, a gamble that relied on untested crews flying obsolete aircraft into the teeth of the most powerful warship afloat. Esmond gathered his aero crews in Victorious's ready room as the carrier steamed through heavy seas at maximum speed. The briefing was blunt: Bismarck was approximately 120 miles ahead, steaming south-southwest at reduced speed due to her fuel leak. Weather was deteriorating. Visibility was poor. The sea state was rough, meaning torpedo launches would be hazardous, the margin for error nearly non-existent. Anti-aircraft defenses were expected to be intense. Bismarck carried dozens of guns ranging from massive flak batteries to rapid-fire cannons, designed specifically to swat aircraft from the sky.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Losses were anticipated. Esmond did not sugarcoat the odds. He did not offer false encouragement. Instead, he spoke of duty, of the men aboard Hood who had no chance to fight back, of the convoys that would die if Bismarck escaped, of the simple fact that they were the only weapon available at that moment, and if they did not try, no one else could. The room was silent when he finished. Then one by one the crews stood, gathering their charts and flight gear, heading for the aircraft waiting on the rain-slicked deck. At 2200 hours on May 24th, just as the late northern twilight began to fade, 9 swordfish launched from Victorious. The carrier pitched in heavy swells, her flight deck rising and falling through arcs of 30 feet. Launching was a controlled fall into the wind, each aircraft clawing for altitude as it left the deck, engines roaring, fabric wings straining. Esmond led the formation, his observer crouched behind him in the cramped cockpit, charts spread across his knees, trying to calculate a course to an enemy moving through fog and gathering darkness. They flew low, just above the wave tops, navigating by compass and stopwatch, trusting that their calculations would bring them to Bismarck and not send them wandering into the empty North Atlantic until their fuel ran out. The cold was brutal. Even through leather gloves and heavy flight suits, the wind cut like knives. Ice formed on the wings, on the struts, on the exposed faces of the crews. The observer in Esmond's aircraft later reported that he could barely feel his fingers, could barely turn the pages of his navigation log. Still they flew on. After nearly an hour, a shadow emerged from the murk ahead. Low and dark against the lighter gray of the sky, unmistakably a warship. Bismarck. She was alone, her escort, Prince Eugen, having separated earlier to continue raiding independently. That was a stroke of fortune. One target, not two, but the fortune was relative. As the swordfish approached, the first tracers arced up from the battleship, bright lines of fire cutting through the gloom. The anti-aircraft barrage began as a rumble, then built into a continuous roar. Shells burst in clusters, black puffs of shrapnel blooming across the sky. Heavier guns fired predictive barrages, trying to create walls of steel that the slow-moving biplanes would fly into. The swordfish scattered, each section breaking into individual attack runs. Doctrine called for coordinated strikes from multiple directions to split the defenses, but in the chaos of weather and gunfire, coordination dissolved into survival. Esmond's section swung wide to approach Bismarck from her port quarter, an angle that offered the largest target profile and the best chance of a hit. Descending to attack altitude meant dropping to within 50 feet of the ocean surface, skimming the swells, using the curve of the earth and the radar shadow of the waves to evade detection until the last possible moment. The swordfish shuddered in the turbulent air, thrown about by gusts and the concussion of exploding shells. Desmonde could see Bismarck clearly now, a massive silhouette throwing up spray as she maneuvered, her superstructure lit by the muzzle flashes of her guns. She was turning, trying to present her stern, the smallest possible target. The range closed, 2,000 yards. 1,500. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, streams of tracers crisscrossing the space the swordfish had to fly through. One aircraft to Desmonde's left took a direct hit, a shell that struck the engine cowling and blew the propeller off. The swordfish nosed down, struck the water, and vanished in a splash of white foam. No parachutes, no survivors. Desmonde pressed on. At 1,000 yards, his observer released the torpedo. The 18-inch weapon dropped away, struck the water, and began its run, a trail of bubbles marking its path toward the battleship. Desmonde pulled hard on the stick, banking away, skimming past Bismarck's bow so close that he could see sailors on deck, could see the flash of their small arms fire directed uselessly at his fleeing. Behind him, other swordfish made their runs. Torpedoes streaked through the water. Bismarck twisted and turned, her helm hard, her speed dropping as she attempted to comb the tracks, presenting the narrowest possible profile to the incoming weapons. Most missed. The torpedoes were old, their gyroscopes imprecise, their propulsion systems prone to failure. Some ran too deep. Others veered off course, but one, launched by a pilot named Percy Gick, found its mark. It struck Bismarck amidships on her armored belt, the explosion sending a column of water towering over her deck. Damage was minimal. The torpedo's warhead was too small to penetrate the thick belt armor, but the psychological impact was enormous. Bismarck had been hit. The invincible fortress had been touched by fragile biplanes that should not have been able to get close. The German crew, rattled, realized they were not as untouchable as they had believed. The swordfish turned for home, those that survived. Of the 9 that launched, 8 returned to victorious, landing in near total darkness on a pitching deck with minimal lighting. 1 had been shot down. The others bore scars, fabric torn by shrapnel, control surfaces shredded, fuel tanks holed. Desmonde's own aircraft had over a dozen holes, none of them critical, but each one a reminder of how close death had come. The strike had not crippled Bismarck, but it had proven something vital. The battleship could be attacked, she could be hit, and if she could be hit once, she could be hit again. Over the next 30 hours, the hunt continued. Bismarck shook off her shadowers in a rainstorm, disappearing into the Atlantic. For a desperate day, the Admiralty lost track of her. Fuel considerations forced some pursuing ships to turn back. It seemed the German battleship might escape after all. Then on the morning of May 26, a Catalina flying boat spotted her, limping toward the French coast, still over 400 miles from safety. Another strike was ordered, this time from HMS Royal, a carrier racing up from Gibraltar. 15 swordfish launched in appalling weather, waves so high that the torpedo bombers had to climb to avoid hitting the crests. The attack was nearly a disaster. The first wave mistakenly attacked the British cruiser Sheffield, shadowing Bismarck. Fortunately, the torpedoes were equipped with new magnetic detonators that malfunctioned, exploding prematurely or not at all. Sheffield emerged unscathed, but the mistake was humiliating. A second strike was prepared, this time with contact detonators, the old reliable technology. 15 more swordfish, launched in failing light with a storm closing in. Among them was Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat, a young Scottish pilot on only his second combat mission. He had barely scraped through flight training, had been told by instructors he would never make a carrier pilot, yet here he was, flying into weather so violent that his aircraft was nearly inverted by wind gusts. The formation reached Bismarck just before sunset. The battleship, alerted by radar, opened fire while the aircraft were still miles away. The sky filled with flak, a curtain of steel so dense that pilots later said it seemed impossible anything could fly through it. The swordfish attacked from every angle, some from the bow, others from the beam, a few from astern, trying to overwhelm the defenses. Torpedoes dropped, most missed. Bismarck, despite her damage, maneuvered desperately, her crew fighting for their lives. Then John Moffat, approaching from the port quarter in the failing light, released his torpedo at point-blank range. It ran true. The explosion struck Bismarck's stern, jamming her rudders 15 degrees to port. The damage was catastrophic. Without steering, the battleship could only steam in wide circles, unable to maneuver, unable to escape. Her fate was sealed. The next morning, May 27, British battleships King George V and Rodney closed in. For 90 minutes, they pounded Bismarck into a burning wreck. Her guns fell silent. Her superstructure collapsed. Fires raged unchecked. Finally, scuttling charges were set by her own crew, and she rolled over and sank, taking over 2,000 men with her. Of a crew of over 2,200, only 115 survived. The sinking of Bismarck sent shockwaves through the Kriegsmarine. The pride of the fleet, the unsinkable battleship, had been crippled by biplanes and finished by gunfire. German naval strategy shifted overnight. Surface raiders were deemed too vulnerable. The big ships withdrew to Norwegian waters, becoming what the British called a fleet in being, a threat that tied down resources simply by existing, but never again venturing into open combat. The Tirpitz spent the rest of the war hiding in fjords, surviving multiple air attacks before finally being sunk in 1944 by RAF Lancaster bombers, carrying massive tallboy bombs. The Scharnhorst was sunk by the Duke of York off Norway's North Cape in 1943, after a running gun battle in Arctic darkness. The Gneisenau was damaged by bombing, later scuttled. The era of the battleship, as the queen of naval warfare was ending, brought down not by other battleships, but by aircraft. Eugene Esmond became a hero, though he never sought the recognition. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership during the Bismarck chase. He continued to fly Swordfish, training new crews, refining tactics, advocating for the importance of naval aviation, even as the technology evolved. By 1942, newer aircraft were entering service, faster, more capable machines. But the lessons learned by men like Esmond, flying obsolete biplanes into the guns of the most powerful warships afloat, had reshaped naval warfare forever. Courage, innovation, and desperation had proven that even the mightiest fortress could be brought low by the smallest weapon, if that weapon was wielded by men willing to press home the attack. Regardless of the cost, the legacy of those swordfish strikes echoed through the rest of the war. At Taranto in 1940, Swordfish had crippled the Italian fleet in harbor, proving that aircraft could project power in ways battleships never could. At Cape Matapan, airstrikes softened up Italian cruisers before the guns finished them. In the Mediterranean, the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, slow fabric biplanes flown by determined crews rewrote the rules. The Japanese studied Taranto closely, learning lessons they would apply at Pearl Harbor. The Americans, watching from across the Atlantic, accelerated their own carrier programs. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun, born not from advanced technology, but from the stubborn effectiveness of pilots flying machines that should have been obsolete, proving that wars are won not by the newest weapons but by the men who refuse to accept that victory is impossible. The winter of 1942 brought new terrors to the English Channel. German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, sat in the French port of Brest like caged wolves. RAF bombers had tried repeatedly to destroy them in harbor, losing dozens of aircraft to flak batteries that ringed the docks. Hitler, paranoid about an Allied invasion of Norway, ordered the ships to make a dash up the channel to German ports, a gamble that defied naval wisdom. The channel was narrow, heavily patrolled, mined, and within easy reach of British air and naval forces. Yet on February 12, under cover of foul weather and electronic jamming, the German squadron steamed north at high speed. British intelligence failed catastrophically. Radar stations missed the ships, reconnaissance aircraft were grounded by weather. By the time coastal observers confirmed the breakout, the German squadron was already passing through the Strait of Dover in broad daylight, protected by a massive umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters. The Admiralty scrambled every available unit. Motor torpedo boats raced from Dover and were driven off by escorting destroyers. Ancient destroyers charged in for a suicidal attack and were blown apart before firing their torpedoes. Then came Eugene Esmond's turn. He commanded 825 Naval Air Squadron, flying Swordfish from RAF Manston on the Kent coast. When the order came, Esmond knew the mathematics of death. 6 Swordfish against 3 capital ships, dozens of escorts, and perhaps 100 German fighters overhead. No fighter escort was available. The Spitfire squadrons assigned to protect them were delayed by confusion and miscommunication. Esmond could have waited. He could have argued for better conditions, more support, a coordinated strike. Instead, he looked at his crews and said simply that duty demanded they go now, while there was still a chance to slow the enemy. They launched at 12:25 hours into a cold February sky. The 6 swordfish formed up and turned northeast, climbing slowly toward the Belgian coast, as Monde led from the front, his observer Lieutenant Edgar Lee beside him, rear gunner leading airman William Clinton manning the single machine gun. Behind them flew 5 more crews, men in their early 20s, some with wives and children waiting at home, others barely old enough to vote. They knew what awaited them. The briefing had been brutally honest. This was not a mission, it was a sacrifice. Over the gray waters off the Belgian coast, they found the German squadron, 3 massive warships steaming in formation, surrounded by a screen of destroyers throwing up wakes like white scars on the sea. Above them, Messerschmitt fighters circled like hawks. The moment the swordfish appeared, the fighters dove. Cannon shells ripped through fabric wings. Tracers stitched lines of fire across the sky. The first swordfish fell within seconds, struck in the fuel tank, exploding in mid-air. The crew had no time to react. The second, flown by Sub-Lieutenant Brian Rose, had its tail shot away. It plunged into the channel, cartwheeling across the surface before sinking. Rose and his crew went down with it. As Monde pressed on, his aircraft shuddered as cannon rounds struck the fuselage. The observer was hit, slumping forward, blood spreading across his flight suit. The rear gunner fired back uselessly, his single machine gun, no match for cannon-armed fighters. Still, as Monde flew straight and level, descending to attack altitude, lining up on Prince Eugen, anti-aircraft fire from the ships joined the fighter attacks. The sky became a solid wall of explosions and tracers. At 800 yards, with his aircraft disintegrating around him, as Monde released his torpedo, it dropped cleanly, struck the water, and began its run. Then a Messerschmitt cannon burst struck Monde's cockpit directly. The swordfish nosed over and hit the sea at full speed, disintegrating on impact. Behind him, the remaining swordfish continued their attacks. Sub-Lieutenant John Thompson pressed through the firestorm, released his torpedo at point-blank range, then was blown out of the sky by flak. His aircraft cartwheeled into the water, killing all 3 crew instantly. Lieutenant Commander Tom Gleave, flying as Monde's deputy, made it close enough to drop his weapon before cannon fire from a Focke-Wulf fighter shredded his wings. The swordfish broke apart in mid-air. Gleave and his crew fell into the freezing channel and drowned before rescue could arrive. Within 5 minutes of contact, all 6 swordfish were destroyed. 18 men died. Not a single torpedo struck home. The German squadron continued unmolested up the channel, eventually reaching German ports after striking mines that caused damage but not destruction. To the British public, it was a humiliation. Enemy warships sailing through the channel in daylight, brushing aside every attempt to stop them. But to the Royal Navy, Eugene Monde's final attack became legend. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. The citation read simply that he led his squadron in a determined attack against overwhelming odds with full knowledge that survival was impossible. 13 of his men received Distinguished Service Orders or Distinguished Service Medals. Their sacrifice, though it achieved nothing tactable, embodied the spirit that would eventually wear down the enemy through sheer refusal to surrender. Yet even as Monde died, the tactics he had pioneered were evolving. New aircraft replaced the swordfish. The Fairey Barracuda, faster and more capable, entered service in 1943. The Grumman Avenger, an American design flown by British crews, brought heavier torpedo loads and better survivability. But more importantly, the doctrine changed. Coordinated strikes became standard. Fighters escorted every torpedo run. Radar guided attackers to their targets through weather and darkness. The desperate improvisations of 1941 hardened into professional methodology. In April 1944, the battleship Tirpitz, hiding in Norway's Kafjord, faced one of the largest airstrikes of the war. 40 barrels from multiple carriers escorted by fighters attacked at dawn. The strike was meticulously planned. Dive bombers hit first, suppressing flak batteries. Then torpedo bombers came in low from multiple directions, splitting the defenses. Tirpitz was struck repeatedly, not by torpedoes this time but by heavy bombs that penetrated her deck armor. Hundreds died. The ship was damaged so severely she never sailed again. Follow-up strikes kept her crippled until November 1944, when RAF Lancasters finished her with earthquake bombs weighing 6 tons each. She capsized in her anchorage, trapping over 1,000 men inside. Scharnhorst met her end off Norway's North Cape on December 26, 1943. Lured out by reports of a vulnerable convoy, she was ambushed by the battleship Duke of York and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. Aircraft played no direct role in her sinking, but reconnaissance planes tracked her every move, denying her the element of surprise that had saved Bismarck briefly. When the guns opened fire in Arctic darkness, Scharnhorst was surrounded, outgunned and doomed. Torpedoes from destroyers finished what gunfire began. She sank with nearly 2,000 men, only 36 surviving the freezing waters. The transformation was complete. In 1939, battleships were queens of naval combat, feared above all else. By 1945 they were targets, expensive liabilities that tied up resources while contributing little. Aircraft carriers became the new capital ships, projecting power across hundreds of miles, capable of striking targets no gun could reach. The men who flew from those carriers, initially in obsolete biplanes, later in modern strikers, had rewritten naval warfare entirely. They proved that armor and guns meant nothing against an enemy who could attack from the sky, could choose the time and place of engagement, could return again and again, until even the strongest fortress fell. The legacy extended far beyond Europe. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese carrier aircraft crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. At Midway, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in minutes, turning the tide of the Pacific War. At Leyte Gulf, kamikaze aircraft became terror weapons precisely because carriers were now the most valuable targets. The battleship era ended not with a whimper, but with fire from above. For the men who started that transformation, the cost was measured in lives. Of the pilots who flew against Bismarck, many did not survive the war. John Moffett, whose torpedo jammed her rudder, lived to old age, but he never forgot the faces of crewmates who died in other strikes. Percy Gick, who scored the first hit on Bismarck, was killed months later in the Mediterranean. The crews who flew with Esmond in that final suicidal charge were remembered in small plaques and memorial stones scattered across Britain, their names known only to family and historians. Yet their contribution changed everything. Today a single swordfish survives in flying condition, preserved by the Royal Navy Historic Flight. It appears at air shows, lumbering through the sky at speeds a modern car exceeds on motorways, looking fragile and absurd. Crowds watch it with nostalgia, unaware of the terror it once inspired. Veterans who see it sometimes weep, remembering friends who flew such machines into hell and never returned. The plane itself is a relic, but what it represents endures. That wars are won not by the strongest weapons but by those willing to use whatever they have against impossible odds. That innovation comes from desperation as often as inspiration, that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. The German battleships lie scattered across the ocean floor now, broken monuments to a doctrine that could not adapt. Bismarck rests 3 miles down in the Atlantic, her hull shattered, her guns silent. Tirpitz was scrapped where she lay, cut apart over years, her armor sold for scrap. Scharnhorst lies off Norway in waters too deep and cold for salvage. They were magnificent machines, marvels of engineering, symbols of national pride. Yet they were obsolete the moment the first torpedo dropped from a fabric-winged biplane and found its mark. The future belonged not to steel and armor, but to men and machines that could adapt, innovate, and refuse to accept defeat. That lesson, written in the cold waters of the Atlantic and the frozen fjords of Norway, remains carved into history, a reminder that the greatest weapon is not the one that cannot be destroyed, but the one the enemy never sees coming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.